Good morning, vinyl community. I'm here to read out the final chapter of The Bug Gets Rich. Let's see, where did I leave off? After being briefly questioned in October, Krenwinkel fled. Instead of going back home to Inglewood, Krenwinkel hid out in Mobile, Alabama. Krenwinkel adopted the alias of Montgomery, which was Tex Watson's mother's maiden name. Tex has long since fled to his hometown of Copesville, Texas. There he had dropped the briefly assumed hippie-looking he cultivated in L.A., hoping to slip unobserved back into small-town Texas life. Watson's partner in crime, Linda Kasabian, had gone underground to Massachusetts. The killer's attempt to elude capture by cutting their ties with the Manson circle don't fit in with the notion of them as zealous disciples of a cult who proudly carried out the ritual murders meant to ignite a race war. On the contrary, their behavior is typical of any run-of-the-mill criminals trying to avoid capture. Not to mention another glaringly obvious and never explained bit of illogic. Why didn't they continue killing random rich piggies, until Helter Skelter actually broke out, if that was indeed their motive? And Watson, who was rapidly forming myth presented by the devil's guru, most devoted right-hand follower, obviously had no intention of ever contracting his supposedly master Manson again. And such inconsistencies were observed by the media, generated excitement around by a tale which Atkins and Graham and the grand jury, the blinding quality of the Manson myth was already at work, even at this early stage of its construction. With Manson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian out of contact with each other, there was no way for them to coordinate their stories if they were interrogated about the murders by the police. Had customary legal procedure been followed, the version of the confession Atkins told Virginia Graham would have been confidential, and her accomplices would never have known about it. That would have allowed the investigation detective to note the inevitable discrepancies in their accounts and perhaps even ascertain the truth about the drug-dealing bases of the murders, which other police detectives have already suspected since August. Although the rest of the world, Watson, Kasabian, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, could now read all about Sexy Sadie's confessions in the daily newspapers. By spreading Atkins' widely distorted story of what happened at Cielo Drive, the mass media conveniently provided Watson, Krenwinkel, Van Houten, and Kasabian with the first draft of the script they had followed on this day. There was no motive for the crimes but killing rich piggies. Manson made us do it, and we were brainwashed. And there was certainly nothing so mundane as a drug robbery involved. Like Atkins, the four other suspects, hoping that by proceeding to be devotees of a cult who had followed their guru's orders to commit a series of random killings for some vague mystical reactionary reason, they might be judged to be insane or sparred from facing the death penalty. The scenario was certainly preferable from a legal standpoint than admitting the truth that they had killed rival drug dealers of their own volition while robbing them to their stash. By this time their trial began, the Melcher revenge and the Beatles race war motive have been given such wide coverage in the international press, nobody was thinking about anything as ordinary as drug dealing anymore. Furthermore, all five of the defendants knew Manson well enough to confidently assume that he would unlikely to reveal the truth about his crimes. They knew this. His outlaw code of honor didn't allow him to cooperate with any law enforcement, even for his own benefit. Through the silence that code demanded, Manson was forced to be a passive participant in extremely supporting the myth of treacherous former friends created about him. At first, some of the defense attorneys later stated Manson thought that the stories Atkins and Bugliosi told were so absurd that surely no jury would fall for them anyway. We may never know to what degree the mob higher-ups among Paul Caruso's clients dictated the story Atkins told Graham, and which was later adopted and refined by other defendants. The end result was that Joel Rostow's name was kept out of the courtroom and only surfaced briefly in the press. Atkins mentioned nothing of the drug dealings of Sebring and Fatowski, but as we shall see, the book that mass marketed the confession makes explicit reference to this crucial factor. If only to dismiss it, the narcotics trafficking motive has been mentioned so often in the press in the 4 months before Atkins' indictment that to leave it unsaid would have been suspicious. The same deliberate misleading strangers informs other more recent volumes in the case. Thus, the uncritical acceptance of the Atkins confession has truly already helped to assure that the crucial mob connections to the Waverly and Cielo Drive victims was effectively concealed for decades. This uncomfortable truth was replaced by the fantastic myth of Manson, the vengeful cult leader, forcing his followers to kill via mind control. And just in this case, there was anyone who wasn't properly indoctrinated into the mob's preferred version of events, extraordinary measures that were taken to assure that they would reach the wildest possible audience. Judge William Keene was assigned to supervise the early phase of the trial, knowing how easy it would be to prejudice a jury by premature exposure of the gathering evidence. Keene explicitly forbade in all involved from discussing any aspect of the case to journalists. But when the gag order was promptly ignored by Susan Atkins' lawyer, Richard Caballero, and Paul Caruso, Judge King was amazingly passive about the blatant transgression. Enter self-described journalist Lawrence Schiller, one of the more intriguing characters to appear in the Manson saga's shadowy margins. This hustler was given the task of organizing the sale of the supposed Atkins confessions to the world press via the Los Angeles Times on December 14, 1969, and was granted credit with a quickly thrown together paper book version, The Killing of Sharon Tate, published by Incestuous by the Times imprint in January 1970. As we shall see, the then radical countercultural journal Rolling Stone's David Dalton and Felton, who exposed the unethical nature of the Schiller affair in the 1970s article on the new Manson case, were absolutely correct when they wrote that the Times people didn't buy the confession, they wrote it word for word. Although he's credited as author, even Schiller admits that he'd never been a writer. He certainly didn't pen a word of the book published under his name. Although Schiller told several sources he interviewed Atkins, but he never even in her presence, the confession was recorded by LA Times writer Jerry Cohen, of whom more presently, even the brief acknowledgments page of Chock-a-Block was the most cynical of lies. The author wishes to acknowledge the assistance of several attorneys involved in this case. While this prime concern of their best interest of their clients, without their help, this book would have been not produced. The unnamed attorneys, Caballero, Caruso, and Bugliosi, who were known, pulled the strings on assigning their cooperative lawyers to Atkins, would not have given less of a damn about the best interests of Susan Atkins. In fact, by cajoling her to put her name into the confession that clearly contrived for her, they tricked her into admitting her own guilt. Furthermore, by making sure her confession reached millions long before the trial even started, they were deliberately sought to make a fair trial for their main target, Charles Manson. All but impossible. This is the message this book strikes again and again, with such statements attributed to Atkins as, Charlie had control over everybody. I never questioned what Charlie said. I just did it. The case against Mastermind Manson has been presented to the public even before his first court appearance. We just need to move to the second paragraph of the acknowledgments to find the next lie. The author wishes to acknowledge the invaluable aid of two journalists who worked for the author in preparing this book on the original interviews with Susan Atkins. Since it sure isn't Schiller, who is the mysterious author, thanking these two helpful journalists, actually what's going on here is that odd case of literary masturbation is that the real author, Jerry Cohen of the Los Angeles Times, is under the guise of Schiller thanking himself and his partner in deception, Dial Torgerson, author Times journalist who helped create the manuscript Schiller was given credit, if that's the word, for compromising, for composing. Just as Ronnie Howard, complicit in the tangled journey to get the fake Atkins confession into the public mind, was murdered in 1979, Cohen and Torgerson also met violent ends. Cohen, beset by failing health, killed himself in 1993. 10 years earlier, his collaborator Torgerson was killed at only 55 when his car was blown up on a Honduras-Nicaragua border by deliberately triggering landmines while he was covering the Reagan administration's dirty war against the Sandinistas in the region. This is amazing. We've already covered Cohen's earlier shady Schiller comparison cooperation, which found the two FBI asset informants striving to cover up the circumstances of the Kennedy assassination by smearing witnesses who wanted to testify about what they knew of a conspiracy to kill the mobbed up Playboy president. And now here's Cohen again in 1969, working once more with Schiller to put forth more lies, to conceal the truth on yet another mysterious mob-ridden case. What's more revealing has just gotten the trial was from its inception. Cohen was his close associate of Vincent Bugliosi. The Times news hound began working as a ghostwriter for a never completed true crime book with the ambitious attorney of full 2 or 3 years before the more lucrative Manson case occupied their attention. Cohen, writing in the voice attributed to Schiller, also tells the lie in The Killing of Sharon Tate that Schiller would be the last newsman to be granted access to Snitchy Sadie's before her trial. What actually happened was that Cohen holed himself up in Schiller's den and churned out the supposed confession of Susan Atkins in a record-breaking 2 days of hasty hack work. You can tell that Bugliosi played a secret role in the scam, was practically admitted by Schiller, who wished all but a wink, told Newsweek, let's just say that the prosecution didn't put up any obstacles. And why would they? The killing of Sharon Tate is quite literally the defense doing the prosecution's work for them. Cohen, in his Schiller voice, pads the first part of this swiftly scribbled paperback with pages of trite pontification, filler essentially characterizing the Tate LaBianca murders as the inevitable progression of hippies, LSD, Haight-Ashbury, and Timothy Leary. The narrative voice tells us that Charlie Manson was one of the satanic mind benders in the Haight. This false occult angle Ed Sanders would later run with is invoked without providing the slightest evidence that there was anything satanic about Manson. We learn that the diabolical character Rasputin liked grip on his followers, strangely considering the fact that one of his chief points of the cover-up and its development was to insist that the victims were strangers to the culprits. Cohen inexplicitly comes close to spilling the beans about the truth in the first few pages. He writes coyly, rich hippies, poor hippies, the beautiful people, the dregs of Haight-Ashbury. They were in and around Hollywood at the same time. One wonders, did their paths ever cross? The Manson family and the Polanski courtier, police say they didn't. Cohen compares Polanski to Manson, painting them both as leaders of their own entourages, even claiming that while Polanski wasn't satanic, he had some interest in the black arts. He didn't. Cohen brings up loose talk about Sebring's sexual proclivities without specifying what this insinuation signifies and acknowledges that it was known that he used drugs. Futowski is described as a heavy narcotics user, hooked on cocaine, and then has begun to experiment with far-out combination of drugs that frightened even his friends. Folger, he writes, with surprisingly accuracy, became a heavy drug user herself, describing the Polanski living room, Cohen as Schiller's pressures that the latter was placed to the much-discussed loft to provide a spectator platform for those who chose to watch rather than participate in the rumored fun and games that went along below. And after all this, Cohen's admission that Manson was going to some of Hollywood's plushest parties comes off as a tacit confirmation that indeed the Haight-Ashbury dregs crossed paths with the beautiful people on the friendliest terms than the bloody mess text left behind on the last visit that would indicate. Cohen and Schiller wonders rhetorically if the seeds of the slaughter may have found in sexual excess, revenge, drug trafficking. Yes, yes, and yes. Page 38 of this book already finds Cohen touch on the truth. Atkins finally admits during the penalty phase of her trial in the form of speculative questions. Both Fatowsky and Sebring were heavily narcotics users. They were also dealers, as some people speculated, and had one or the other pulled a double cross. He even brings up the reports in the press about We Told K's claims to the police that the killings were drug related, but dismisses his suspicions as merely one of the endless blind leads which police chase down. On page 41, the truth is touched on again, only by a waved aside of just another false lead. Speculation continues to center on the likelihood of the Polish playboys having been the prime target of the Benedict Canyon massacre because of his suspected involvement with trafficked drug dealers. Cohen amusingly praises some of their own earlier Times articles about the murders without mentioning that he's their author. Ultimately, when it comes to the motive, Cohen as Schiller is vague, setting the stage for Ed Sanders to OEO to come. OEO. It was a satanic, that's supposed to scare you, yeah. It was a satanic whim which sent these people into Benedict Canyon. Charlie are assured, gave the orders. The relatively brief chapter of this book purporting to be the transcript of Atkins' supposed confession is surely based on some of her words, but is obviously funneled through Cohen and or Torgenson's two-day ghostwriting prism. Atkins is ultimately vaguely quoted as saying that the motive was both to instill fear into Terry Melcher because Terry had given his word on a few things and never came through with them, and while they were at it, to instill fear in man himself, man the establishment. That's what it was done for, to instill fear, to cause paranoia. Certainly nothing about Linda's avenging Wojtek's drug burn, no bottomless pits, no beetles, no intricate plan to take over the world after the racial Armageddon. Atkins later forcefully denied that Bugliosi's helter-skelter motive was in any way valid, but in one blink and you'll miss it, quote, attributed to her for the first early whisper of the race war motive to come, and can see confirmed to a single sentence referring to the murders as having been executed to also show the black man how to go about taking over white man. Atkins claims she threw the hand towel over Sebring's head, although Charlie later copied to throw in the towel when he went to the crime scene after the slaying was over. Atkins also recalls that while she waited in the car outside the LaBianca house while Manson and Watson were inside, she fell asleep, seeing what was going on inside through the medium of a remote viewing dream. Upon arriving at Waverly, she also says she asked Charlie inside the house that we took the acid in. When he corrects her, saying it was the true house next door, she adds that Charlie would have picked it to instill a lot of fear in them because they had just totally blanked out on us. They were people who had given their word, went backed out of it like Terry Melcher, Jerry Cohen's friend and collaborator, Vince Bugliosi, the eminence Grise hovering in the background of the book's composition, hadn't quite figured out the details of the far more elaborate fiction he was preparing to present in court some 6 months later. And yet the mostly forgotten killing of Sharon Tate is really Helter Skelter's first draft. The mendacious legal gambit disguised as a book not only set the stage for convicting Manson before his trial, in many ways, it set the prototype for almost all Manson literature to come. We can end this chapter here now. The next chapter is called In the Library of Lies, the Literary Autopsy. So we thank all the vinyl members and vinyl community for interested in my work. Like and subscribe. God bless the children.